Good evening. My name's Tom Giroux. I'm the Vice President of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. That's my official title, but I actually prefer the Zoom guy since I run all the Zoom meetings with Donald Schnitzler. We're going to have a really great presentation tonight, but a little bit first about the Forest History Association. You see our mission up on the screen. Our mission is to inform, educate, archive, and publish. Part of tonight's program is the inform and educate. And if you support this mission, I'd encourage you to consider joining the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. You can go to our webpage and click on membership. It's easy $20 a year, and you'll support our efforts to do this type of programming throughout the year. So I'm going to turn it over to Don, who's going to talk about a little bit about the program tonight and the process for our Zoom.
Okay, as Tom said, my name is Don Schnitzler. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Forest History Association, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to this webinar. This evening's talk is entitled Hickory, Dickory, Duck, the Ghost Lumber Ports of Lake Michigan. It's going to be presented by Dr. Amy Rosebrough. Amy is a staff archaeologist with the Office of the State Archaeologist at the Wisconsin Historical Society. She's a native of the Missouri Ozarks. She has had an interest in burial monuments and archaeology for a long time. She's also an alumni of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she received her doctorate for region-wide analysis of Wisconsin's effigy mounds and mound builders. She has worked as an archaeologist in academic, private, and public sectors. In her current position at the Wisconsin Historical Society, she manages archaeological and burial sites data, assists Wisconsin citizens with archaeological questions, and serves as a subject matter expert. She spends her spare time volunteering as a heritage garden caretaker, quilting, baking, and editing archaeology manuscripts. Tonight, she will share a history of entrepreneurs and businessmen of the last half of the 1800s who constructed dozens of privately funded bridge piers along the western shore of Lake Michigan. At these piers, Wisconsin's forests were exchanged for manufactured goods and new settlers. The piers and their associated general shores and lumber mills became seeds around which busy shipping hubs, villages, and towns grew and briefly thrived and helped to decide the future of eastern Wisconsin's economy. Through creations of 19th century lumber boom, they and their owners helped to save the lakeshore counties when nature and waste turned against local residents and provided the means for life to continue when the trees were gone. Ongoing research by archaeologists and divers with the Wisconsin Historical Society is bringing back the stories of lost communities such as Ronksville, Carlton, Langworthy, telling the forgotten tales of life in Wisconsin's ghost ports. So I'm looking forward to hearing Amy talk. But before we get and turn the screen over to Amy, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions as Amy is presenting tonight, you can jot those down in the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. And so if you look at the Zoom screen in the bottom, just left of center, there'll be a chat feature that you can type those questions into. We'll hold all questions until the presentation is over and then relay them to Dr. Rosebrough for her to answer at the end of the talk. If you experience any difficulty with the Zoom platform during the presentation, you can put the questions or comments in the chat feature. Tom and I will monitor it and we will attempt, and I do emphasize attempt, to fix or resolve any issues as they come up. And finally, the presentation is being recorded, and before tomorrow morning, it should be up on the Forest History of Wisconsin's YouTube channel, where you can find all of our past webinars for viewing also. And with that, I'm pleased to turn this over to Dr. Rosebrough for her presentation. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to just double check that you can see the right screen. You see my title slide? I
All
hope.
right.
Yeah,
Here, there we go. I
yep,
think that's got it.
we got
Okay.
it.
All right. Whew. Always a little nervous about that step. So much can go wrong. So thank you so much again for having me here to talk to your group. As you can tell from the bio, my background is mostly burial mounds. So this has been a whole new area of subject study for me, and one that I've become utterly enamored and fascinated with. There are some amazing stories to tell about Wisconsin's ghost ports and lost communities. And so my goal tonight is to try and bring some of these back to life and to get people thinking about what was going on in rural Wisconsin when Wisconsin's coastal cities were being built, and what's happening to the forests, and what happens when you log too much. All right, can I get this to go? Yes, there we go. All right. So this is a story about places that are lost. History that has been very nearly forgotten, and stories that very few people remember nowadays. It's a story about an entire landscape that made Wisconsin, Wisconsin, and a reminder that places and the people who lived and worked in them, even forgotten ones, still leave echoes behind. The story begins for us with this ship, the Northerner. It's a lumber schooner built in 1851. It sank off of Port Washington in 1868 after it began to leak while loading cordwood in a community called Amsterdam, which is another one of the ghost port communities. And this isn't unusual. The lumber schooners were usually older ships. If they leaked a little, the cargo would get ruined, and the wood was thought would help them float. If they did, it didn't. This one, unfortunately, the Northerner leaked a little too much, and down she went. The ship was investigated by our maritime staff, Tammy Thompson and others, and featured on an Archaeology Month poster in 2010. And this is May, this is Archaeology Month, so good timing on this little tidbit here. It was just another survey for them, but it led to a lot more. And if you look at the hold in the wreck, and I hope you can see my cursor down here, you'll see that there is cordwood still stacked up inside the hold of the Northerner. When she went down, she was owned by a businessman named Nicholas Ronk, which explains where the Ronk part of Ronksville comes from, Ronksville being her home port. At the time the Northerner investigation was going on, people saw Ronksville and, well, it has something to do obviously with the Ronk family, but we're not really sure what that's about because we can't find Ronksville on a map. Well, subsequently, we were contacted by these three gentlemen, David Hearn on the left, Jonathan Ronk in the center, and David Allstat on the right, independently asking for copies of the poster and all saying, we're related to the people that own the Northerner. Well, they're related to each other, as it turns out, and here they are sitting in the Lake Church Tavern in Lake Church, Wisconsin, just east of Belgium. And I am extraordinarily saddened to say that that building burned down last night. So we've lost a lovely historic piece of Wisconsin's history, and something that was very important to this family, because one of the Ronk brothers, one of the original owners of the Northerner and the Ronks Pier, owned and operated this tavern. So we've lost a piece of our ghost port history here just in the last few hours. But they all had a question for us. They said, can we help them find Ronksville? Can we help them find their ancestors' port? And so they contributed some research that they had done. We did some research on our end, and we're able to bring Ronksville back to life at least a little bit. So here are Nicholas and Paul Ronk, owners of the Luxemburger Pier Company, and they are sitting on their pier, the two gentlemen here in the front with workmen behind them. And you see the pier stretching out into the lake, a little rail or tram system for moving wood out, a crane for loading. The pier was constructed in 1859, just before the onset of the Civil War. It was the home port of the Northerner. Where exactly it was, we weren't sure. They were able to contribute a map that showed a road leading to the pier and the holdings of the Luxemburger Pier Company. We were able to find Ronksville on a chart, and comparing the two, they lined up very well. I was like, okay, we've got Ronksville. So the chart done in 1866 shows the pier extending out into the lake and a small string of buildings, both circled, leading back along the road I just mentioned to the main road in town. And then that would have then gone inland to Lake Church, where the Ronk brothers held not just their tavern, but several other businesses, including a hotel. The census records for 1860, however, don't say that they're hotelers or that they're tavern keepers or they're merchants. They say that they are dealers in cut wood. So there's an apparent disconnect happening here. And as our research continued, we realized Ronksville, it's not just Ronksville. There are dozens of these little lost communities all up and down the Lake Michigan shoreline. This map just shows the one in Ozaukee County north on the Lake Michigan side of Door County. They continue almost all the way to the Chicago area and down around Green Bay as well, mostly associated with lumber and wood transport. Why? Well, there's a very good answer for that. It has to do with the lake. If you look at these places today, so this is Grimm's Pier, for example, you don't see anything for the most part. They are completely gone. They are true ghost ports and ghost communities. But they were established because the lake bottom does certain things and because the forests allowed it and because commerce demanded it. So let's take a look. So Ronksville is down here around Port Washington. It's just not the nearest pier north of Port Washington, but the next nearest. Okay. The southern ghost ports operated like Ronksville, mostly in dealing cut wood, cordwood. Okay. Why cordwood? Well, because people needed wood to fuel the steamships that were going up and down the lake. The boilers demanded heat, they demanded fuel, and cordwood was a way to do it. The cities needed heat for stoves, for cooking, for other steam engines. And so the cordwood trade was a big trade. There wasn't much else wood-wise on the southern portion of the lakeshore counties. There were no great stands of white pine down there. This was mostly a hardwood species, so cordwood is the main use that they found for those trees. If you get a little further away from the coastline, farmers clearing those forests were just cutting them for the most part and letting the trees rot. But near the coast, they could ship them and they could ship them easily. So people began putting these piers out. Think of them like the gas stations of their day. So this is a small version, because there aren't that many photos of the cordwood piers extant. This is a little version in Lake Geneva of all places. So a couple of lake steamers, and you can see there's a great big heap of cordwood and more cordwood piled up, ready to be loaded. Kind of a little inland gas station, we'll call it, here on the small lake. So going back to the north, between Sheboygan and Manitowoc, we had other piers, most used to ship out wood and farm products, but most of these had a fairly diverse economic base. You're not quite to the pineries yet, but you're getting further and further away from the big cities. So people are looking for ways to sustain themselves, to sustain these little communities as the cordwood is very quickly used up. McCree owned a brick yard. One of the owners here shipped bricks along with lumber and grain. Centerville was the largest. They had a planing mill along with a brewery. So they were shipping good German beer for quite a while until the brewery burned to the ground. Oh, I've gotten stuff out of order. Okay, I knew something was off here coming up. All right, so why are these piers there? Well, because you can't sail straight up to the beach. And you can, but this is what happens. Your ship wrecks. So you need piers to extend out into the lake in order to get commerce back and forth. So this is why these piers are being built here. Okay, here we go. Now we're back on track. Okay, so the northern piers are up in the pinery country. So the great stands of white pine in northern Manitowoc County up all the way to the tip of Door County, and tons of piers in this area. So I'm not even scratching the surface on Door County. We have a local history that said there were at one point 60 of these private piers extending out into the lake shore on Door County shores, both the bay and the lake side. And the amount of wood that they were moving, it was absolutely and utterly unbelievable. Oh, looking at, so Dana is published in 1866. He was a lumber merchant in Chicago. So right at the beginning of the great lumber boom up in northern Wisconsin, he provides a written overview of the trade in Chicago up till that point, and is trying to get the scale across to his readers. So 3 years, so this is again the 1860s, so right through the Civil War, 3 years, If the wood coming to Chicago was composed entirely of boards a foot wide, that would make a bridge to the moon with 40,000 miles to spare, which again it defies comprehension. He also calculated that the wood brought in Chicago between 1855 and 1866 was enough to build a two-story building 100 feet wide from Chicago to San Francisco, and that building would be capable of housing the entire population of Europe at that time. The Wisconsin's total pine production between 1840 and 1873 was 86 billion board feet, which is enough to wrap around Earth's equator 650 times. So Wisconsin's forests were moving to Chicago. And if they were within range of the lake counties, they were moving on these piers. They were being shipped from the big ports. This is a bird's eye view of Kewanee after their harbor is established, 1870s, 1880s. Kewanee, Algoma, Manitowoc, Sheboygan, most of our lake cities are established where the large rivers come in, where logs can be boomed down and you have a larger hinterland. They are the places that are settled first. They have the potential for harbors, which provide refuge to ships. So they get public funding, federal funding, state funding, even local funding. So the local businessmen were raising money. There's a lovely newspaper article from Racine. It talks about businessmen, empty your pockets. We've got to get a harbor built here. Sheboygan applied for funds to the federal government. And when the Fed said, well, why should we? They said, look, every ship that has made this their home port has sunk. Every single one at some point, because they're hitting the reefs, they're hitting the bars, and the losses are equaling the value of the stuff we're shipping out right now. So it doesn't make any sense for us to even continue supplying Chicago if you can't give us a harbor. And the federal government agreed. Elsewhere along the coast, however, in between what are going to become the port cities are these smaller tributaries. So this is a little creek that empties out at what was Langworthy Pier. And you can see it's not much. But if you dam it up, it's just enough in the spring to raise up a mill pond about 8-10 feet deep. And that will store logs. You can't boom much down it, but it will give you just enough water power, just enough area for log holding to put in a small mill. And that's what private individuals and partnerships began to do, again, all up and down the Pinery coast. So here's Kewanee. So this becomes a large port city, or large-ish, not like Milwaukee, but decent size for this area. But it starts out just like all the others with a pier. Again, you can't get the ships to the beach, so you've got to get the timber out into the lake, and the bridge pier is how it's done. So the bridge pier gets its name because there's a bridge portion that arches over the beach. You can walk under it, and then it extends out, in some cases, up to 1,100, 1,200 feet out into the lake, where the schooners have 8, 10, 12 feet of depth that they can be relatively safe in. They'll pull up, they load, they unload any cargo they might have to supply the community, and then take off for Chicago, Milwaukee, or Racine again. Prior to this point, everyone had to lighter in. Schooners would come to about that distance from shore, and then if it was timber products, say for building a mill or a building, they would just throw it into the water and let it wash ashore. If it's people or goods, say immigrants coming in, they'd be put down to the ship's boat and then brought in. And so many of the immigrants along this stretch of shore, they enter their life in Wisconsin with wet feet because they're having to jump. In some cases, the ship's yawls and boats are swamping in the waves once they get a little closer in. They can be built with cribs. So imagine a log cabin kind of construction. These are built up on the lake ice, and the photo on the right, ooh, I'm glad we got a copy of this. This photo was hanging in the Lake Church Tavern, the one that burned just last night. So I think the original for this may have just been lost. This photo was supplied to us by courtesy of the Ronk family. This is the Luxembourger Pier Company constructing a crib, and you see that they're up on the ice. They built the crib. They've got it filled with angular stone ballast. And they're waiting for the lake to thaw just enough to drop this crib down into the water. This is how Ronksville is built, the Ronksville Pier. And when we did go out to find that pier for them, this is what we found. Not the cribs themselves, they're long since gone, but the angular stone ballast has spilled out along the lake shore. Portions of the pier itself have washed up on the beach so that the family was able to touch it. That's really all that's left there. Now, if they don't judge, of course, the depth of the lake right, this drop a little too far. Okay, so hopefully they know what they're doing. Luxembourg Pier Company seems to have been pretty good at what they were doing. And then on the left, you've got the Basswood Island Quarry. This is up in Lake Superior, where the crib itself is still preserved. The other way to build a pier is through pier pilings. So here's the Centerville Pier, and most of the piers along the Lake Michigan shore south of Door County and kind of north of Ronks are built using the piling method. And this is very late in this pier's lifespan. You see people kind of taking some recreation and fishing out on it, some people in a canoe under it. And notice that there are many, many more pilings here than are needed to support the pier. Some don't even go all the way up to the pier decking. And this is an indication that this pier has been rebuilt, as pretty much all of them were, multiple times for multiple reasons. They would be damaged, destroyed, they'd burn, ships would run into them, run through them, lake ice would come up and heave them and take pieces, in some cases hundreds of feet away. Big storms would knock parts over, as they were constantly having to perform repairs on these piers. So they bring out steam pile drivers. The people that owned those pile drivers were sort of like thinking like the valued contractors at the time. They'd be moving up and down the coast, helping these people get the piers back in order for the shipping season. It's a very, very seasonal industry at first. The piers made it possible for the Great Northern Forest to move south, and the lumber then was used to build not just Wisconsin cities, but cities all across the Midwest. So wood sent to Chicago is shipped out by railroad all across the central United States. We've got a couple of gentlemen here standing next to a couple of great big stumps. This is just kind of an example of what the pineries and the forest would have looked like at one time. Well, people head out into the woods to get that lumber. In northern Wisconsin, especially on the lakeshore counties, is very much a winter activity. So you have a photo of a Wisconsin lumber camp circa 1875, and you see all the snow on the ground, snow on the roofs. It must be a nice day. They're not too bundled up here. But honestly, the colder, the better. The more snow they had, the better. And it had to be the right kind of snow, because this is how you move the wood from one place to another. So this shot courtesy of the Kewaunee County Historical Society. You see a load ready to be taken to one of the piers. And the size of the load, for one thing, is immense. You've got a 4-horse team pulling it. And what interests me about this shot is where the driver is sitting. When you read these original newspaper accounts, there's just account after account after account of the drivers being injured as the loads shift and move when chains snap. Sometimes the loads will fall on the horses and spook the horses, and off they go, and it's just disaster. So they're moving these on ice roads through the timber regions out to the piers. At some of the piers, again, there are small mills set up, sash mills, planing mills, lath mills, very small operations for the most part once you're out of Algoma and Kewaunee. Something akin to this, if not even a little smaller. So this is one of the inland communities. The Burmeister Mill in Kewaunee is one a little bit inland. Okay. The wood is then planed down into lumber, made into posts, made into telegraph poles, cut into shingles. Taken then to the pier yards. So here's the pier yard in Jacksonport in Door County. And I like this image, not just for the scale of what's being stockpiled here awaiting shipping, but look in the background of that row of buildings. So this is where the ville in Ronksville comes from. This is why we call them ghost towns sometimes and not just ghost piers. That each one of these communities had a support complex associated with it. Not just lumber, but bark, tanning bark, hemlock bark is being brought up and stored. And it's not just lumbermen and the big companies that are bringing wood into the piers. The local farmers are as well. So here's a gentleman on the Wannock farm. It says picking up wood, but I'm pretty sure based on what I see around him that he's engaged in making shingles. Shingles at the time were basically currency on the Kewaunee and Door County coast. You could bring in loads of these to the pier companies and they would buy them from you. At the end of a season, you'd get X amount of money back based on how much you'd brought in, or you could exchange it for goods at the company store, which we'll get to in just a second. So wood is coming in from all directions. Now, if you're an immigrant coming in, you're arriving this region into land that has been homesteaded for you, or you're claiming up, chances are it's covered in thick forest. And if you're, let's say, from Norway, you're used to some forest, but you're also used to cleared farms. And we have settlers' accounts of people coming in just utterly perplexed because they're expecting more open country, and they find dense cedar forest, and they're like, what am I going to do with this? And the people who are aware of what they can do with it are explaining, no, no, no. You make this into posts, you make this into shingles, you make this into railroad ties. Take them to the piers, they'll buy them from you, and you can make a little money back. You're clearing your land and making a little extra cash too. Here's the Two Creeks Pier. This is just south of the Kewaunee County line. This is owned by the Feaster and Vogel Leather Company out of Milwaukee, one of the largest tanning firms in the United States for a while. Just an idea of how these would have looked. Not a great photo, but it's, there's not many photos of these at all when they're still in operation. And you can see the pilings extending out in the lake. There are a couple of service buildings at the end. One of these may be a granary. The other is probably a warehouse or shelter for pier workers. And you see there's even a schooner pulled up alongside this one. Newport Pier up in Door County. This is a crib pier. And you're again looking down the decking. Notice there are no guardrails or safety rails at all. And again, you're looking towards town and you see all the buildings and the pier yards there. So you're looking at the support complex here, mostly on the left of the pier. And the gentleman is standing there at the point where the pier widens out near its terminus. So here's the Sandy Bay Pier, very late in its history after most of the pier deteriorated, but you can still see that it goes out and then it widens out of this T shape. This is done so that horse teams and ox teams can turn around on the pier without running into the danger of falling into the water and knocking anybody else in. The ships are serviced by the Lake Fleet. So lumber schooners like the JV Taylor. Here it is unloading cargo. In this case, looks like cut lumber. Okay. And when those ships return north, they bring with them goods for the pier stores, the company stores. Every single one of these piers was accompanied by a store. Now, this is incredibly good economics on the part of the pier owners and managers. They are buying lumber, but they also want to make money. So they don't want to shell out cash to the local population if they can help it. So they put up these stores. They fill them up with the kind of goods that people want and need. Here's the interior of the Carlton store. The only shot I've ever found of any of the interior is one of these. It's basically just a general goods store. So you see a customer and a clerk standing there. There are horse blankets, tackle, sacking. Looks like lanterns hanging for sale. There are some casks to the far right of what are possibly kerosene or molasses. We know they sold these items because we have inventories for some of these from the newspapers. They sold bonnets, they sold dresses, they sold boots, they sold shoes, they sold hardware, they sold cookware. If you were a lumberman or an incoming settler, they sold what you needed. So if you're bringing in shingles, well, yeah, you can exchange it for cash, or you could exchange it for credit towards some of these items. That way, the pier stores are supplying the enterprises that are changing the counties from forest to farm. They're also making money, hopefully, if the price sheets are balanced right, they're making money on both ends. The owners are making money at the store, they're making a profit on every piece of goods sold, and they are also making money in Chicago when they sell the lumber that is coming in for stockpiling. So let's take a close-up look at Kewaunee. So thank goodness, thanks to a very, very generous grant from the Coastal Management Program, we received funding to do a deep dive, and literally a deep dive, or shallow dive anyway, and some onshore investigation of several of the ghost port communities up in Kewaunee. So we started at Sandy Bay to the south. We skipped the observation point or Sprague's Pier there because it's on the grounds of the Kewaunee nuclear power plant, and they weren't too thrilled to have us right next to the reactor, and we weren't really looking forward to that either. Sandy Bay just to the north, however, we did get permission to enter that property. Dean's Pier or Carlton is next. Skip over Kewaunee. because it turns into a port city. Then Grimm's Pier, Alaska Pier. We attempted to locate Langworthy or Casco Pier, could not find any trace of that one. It's under the onshore portions are under a wayside. There is a historic marker there, so you can stop and visit that community, but there's nothing offshore that we could find. Next up is Silver Creek. We weren't even aware that pier existed at the time we did the study. That's come out just in the past few weeks through our archival searches. And then Foscaro, again, we attempted to find that pier and were unable to. So that one also appears to have vanished pretty completely. So this is what we were looking for. So this is one of the pier pilings just under the surface of the water. So when the visibility is good, the water's fairly clear, you can glide right over these and mark them that way. So we would hang over the front of the boat. And as our pilot would troll us slowly back and forth, everyone's keeping an eye out for shadows and pilings. We would see one, someone would yell, you know, dead ahead, swerve, or off to the right, off to the left. And we would throw in these little floating marker buoys. And after a while, we'd wind up with a line of them heading towards the beach that marked the line of the pier. At that point, those of us who are terrestrial archaeologists, myself included, would conduct a reenactment of the storming the beaches at Normandy with our gear, run onto the shoreline, set up our survey equipment, and the divers would go into the water with the stadia rod for the transit, and then go from one marker, from one pier to another, as we shot those positions in from the beach. You see this way off in the distance there, because again, these piers are immense. We were pushing the limits of the total station and the ability to do this. We got it out, I think, to about 1,100 feet at one point, so it was getting a little iffy at that range. The divers then are also taking notes on what they're seeing. So there are items in some cases around the pier pilings. It's not just one piling at a location. It may be 2, 3, 4, or 5. So they're doing a sketch map at that point too, which allows us then to reconstruct the piers as they look now. We wanted that information because, again, we know these piers are rebuilt over and over, and we want to see if we can find any evidence of incidents that are discussed in the historic records and the newspaper articles. The goal is then, between the surveys and our archival research, interviews with landowners, investigations onshore and offshore, we want to bring these communities back to life, to bring the whole story of the coastal economy back into Wisconsin's consciousness, because these were thriving, wonderful communities where all kinds of things happened. It's not just lumber shipping, they're important places. So we'll start with Alaska, the furthest north. Named supposedly because well, the person who founded this said it was as cold as Alaska. We actually think this is named because Alaska had just been admitted, or had just been purchased, sorry, at the time this pier was founded, 1867, 1868. So pier and store are built by Hitchcock and Company, which Hitchcock, his brother-in-law, Walter Johnson, and Wojciech Maszek, who owned each of them thriving stores in Kewaunee to start with. So these are already a fairly wealthy set of individuals. Okay. They decide, okay, there's money to be made just north of town. We're going to build our own pier and kind of capture some of the lumber trade north of Kewaunee, okay, expand the reach of the forest that we can gather into our own stocks. Wojciech Maszek had a brother-in-law named Frank Quapel, who needed a job at this point. He'd been recently let go from the army. He'd served in the Civil War, had been wounded fairly severely at Chancellorsville, but still served out his time in reserves. And so he's looking for a job, kind of bopping around the state, tried photography, that didn't work, tried house painting, that didn't work. He worked as a clerk in the store with his brother-in-law, Maszek. That worked okay. So Wojciech said, okay, I'm going to give you a job. You manage this pier. And he did a fantastic job at it. By the time everything's done, so Wojciech Maszek winds up the first mayor of Kewaunee. Frank Quapel, the brother-in-law, winds up mayor of Algoma. So they both rise right up in the world. So the next major event in Alaska is in 1871 when the Peshtigo fire sweeps through. 1879, it's sold to another company, it's Schimmeljonda, and then Quapel again. So Frank Quapel has purchased a share and is now part owner. And then 1880, the schooner Anthorine wrecks at the pier, but is refloated. And again, that's a story that happens at all of these locations. So here's Alaska in 1876. And you'll notice there's the pier. They've got their own post office. They've got their own telegraph office. There's an indication for the store. The word shop, in this case, we believe means blacksmith shop. And H&K for Hitchcock and Quapple. So they're co-owning at 1876. So I don't think Quapple's exactly an owner at this point, more managing. You see Quapple's own farm that he's purchased just to the south. And then the pier road extending in. As it appears today, so we're trying to relocate these. It's not lining up exactly. The map's putting quite a few of the buildings in the ravine for that little creek, so that's not quite right. If you zoom in, if you look to the far right of this image, you'll see a bunch of little dots and a tiny little note that says piling. So we're going to zoom in a little bit further. Okay. That's all, unfortunately, that's left of the pier. So one little straggly line of piers, and you can see some of them are doubled, indicating at least one rebuilding episode. Okay. The rebuilding episode is not due to the Great Fire. We know it survived that. So here's an image of Chicago. So that'll have to stand in here. Okay. Well, the papers specifically call out Alaska Pier for the Great Fire. I say probably the hardest effectual fight against the fire is being made at Hitchcock, Moshek, and Quapple's place in Piercetown. Their piers stored goods and stock of ties, postwood, valued in all at $17,000, were only saved by almost superhuman exertions of large gangs of men kept continually at work. The scow Alaska was compelled to leave the pier when only partly loaded on account of the fire, and the pier was on fire 3 or 4 different times. The store and pier of Mr. Grimm, just to the south, were also saved by hard work and hard work alone. Now, think about what's actually happening here. The people who are helping save this pier are doing so because their families are standing on the pier. Their possessions are loaded on the pier. The scow Alaska was kept at the pier, as many of the ships were along the coast in the lead up to the fire, because people were worried that they would need to evacuate. So ships were prevented from leaving. Kewanee and the other town, they're saying, you cannot go. We're going to have to load our population possibly and our possessions onto you to escape this. So they are fighting literally for the lives of their loved ones and for their own lives at this point. They've got to keep this pier functioning, because if they can't keep the pier from catching on fire, they can't load the Alaska. It's like having the lifeboat suddenly vanish on the Titanic. But they managed to save most of the complex. There were some losses there, but Alaska never really recovers anyway. The lumber boom comes and goes very quickly at this location. And after there's not much pine left to load, the pier itself isn't needed. It fades away. So by 1895, Alaska has relocated almost bodily a mile inland to where the tavern and saloons were. So let's go to where the business is. So Alaska today is not where Alaska was. So Alaska is still on the map, but not at the coastal location. And if you look there now, we're going to go underwater just a minute. Here's some of the grouping of some of the pier pilings just under the surface. So we'll jump south to Grimm's. So we just mentioned Grimm's Pier and that article on the fire. As one of our volunteers, Bob Jake, standing on the beach with the total station. And we're going to look over his right shoulder in the distance at that great big rock sticking out of the shore. So that is kind of the story of Grimm's Pier in a nutshell. He built it in a terrible location. So he built the pier and store 1867, finished up again in 1868. Oops. And I've got a date wrong. I apologize for this. So the rival Rex, I believe that is 69. Sorry, that should be 69, not 64. Schooner rival Rex at Grimm's Pier. Second vessel sinks and is refloated that year. They're hitting these rocks. There's a massive shoal and boulders just under the surface, kind of hiding like landmines all around. So the schooners are running right into them. Okay. 1870, unknown vessel again strikes another rock and is lost at pier. 1871, schooner Swallow sinks and is refloated. That's the year of the Great Fire. 1874, the Hercules sinks. Might have been refloated, we think so. 1877, horses and a wagon do a Thelma and Louise off the end of the pier. They sink. And in 1881, Henry Grimm is done. He can't take it anymore. He sells out. He eventually moves into Algoma, owns a hotel, and then his son, Henry Grimm Jr., goes into the lumber business and furniture manufacturing, actually makes quite a name for himself there. Grimm's Pier, as you can see, did not have the community that Alaska ever managed to have. Grimm was an independent businessman. He did not have the financial backing and wherewithal that Hitchcock and Moshak and Quapple did. So the map just shows Grimm and his store. All he ever had. Again, affected by the fire, we do know that refugees were gathering on these piers during the fire and afterwards awaiting evacuation out of the burnt over country. He loses in the fire 20 tons of hay, 500 bushels of oats, all his farming equipment, 9 sleighs, 8,000 hops poles, 7,000 railroad ties, 500 cedar posts, 460 cords of maple, 150 cords of beech, 18 cords of tanning bark, but did manage to save the store and the pier. And I'm sure he's thinking, yeah, well, whoopee. At least he was able to keep shipping for a while, but he suffered some immense losses in the fire. It's an 1838 aerial photo, and you just see a smudge offshore, the remnants of the pier peeking up at that time, and not a building to be seen. So we're not even, the store should have been up and around this location just south of those 2 trees. So kind of a reconstruction where the rival and the schooner at least hit, we have that record. So they're hitting the shoal just to the north of the pier as they're coming and going. Zooming in. Here's Grimm's Pier again. Okay. There's a little bit more of the body of the pier left along with some of the superstructure that's fallen around it at this one. If you kayak or canoe, I really do recommend visiting these locations and seeing what you can see. So the locations themselves can be quite beautiful. So we're going to jump over Carlton for a second, go down to Sandy Bay. You see why it gets its name, lovely sand beach and bluffs here. Sandy Bay is one of the first piers built, a second pier actually in Kewaunee County. The first is Volk's Pier up in Kewaunee itself. So John and Mary McNally, he's a whaler of all things from Ireland, decides to come and do the lumbering business for a little while. He had been a Great Lakes sailor, decides to try something new. He and his wife Mary settle at Sandy Bay and build a tiny little pier and mill of their own. They're active in local politics. They get a post office opened as early as 1858. Then in 1872, Feaster and Vogel, the leather company that owned 2 creeks, purchased the pier and start using it as a kind of a satellite to their 2 Creeks operation and 2 Creeks tannery. They're mostly interested in shipping bark out because the creek that drains out at this pier has its headwaters in a massive stand of hemlock. So they're looking for that hemlock bark. McNally opens a hotel in 74 when he realizes he's not going to make much money milling and kind of turns all the rest of it over to Feaster and Vogel. They sell out just a few years later, and then their manager, John Weigley, buys in. But again, by this point, the lumber boom, the pinery boom is pretty much over. And so he moves into farming. And by 1880, the portions of the complex are being torn down. And not long after that, the tug Thomas Spears is passing by, catches fire, tries to make the pier, doesn't quite make it, and sinks. Here's a map. So you see Sprague's Pier, the 1866 coastal chart, just to the south here. Again, this is where the power plant is now. We can't get to that, but just north the McNally Mill and Feaster and Vogel Pier complex at Sandy Bay. No, they picked this location, but it had one of the larger tributary streams. So this is it goes by Thornapple Creek. I've seen Fish Creek, Fisher Creek for this one. I don't know that it really has a settled name yet, but a little harder to dam, but a much larger mill pond, which is what attracted McNally to this location in the first place. 1876, again, there's the pier. They've got a post office. They do get a telegraph office eventually at this location. It's shown under Feaster and Vogel management. There's the pier store, McNally's hotel just across the way, and then McNally's holdings, including his son, Henry McNally at this point around. And the Feaster and Vogel buildings are shown to the north and northeast of this intersection. And kind of an idea of what the line of the pier would have looked like extending out into the lake from the bluffs above, from the original McNally mill site. In 1871, this pier shipped out 1,200 cords of wood, 1,000 cedar posts, 700 cords of bark, and 12,000 railroad ties, and that was a bad year for them. Again, this is a little port, and they are shipping out, again, immense quantities of wood. The next year, they shipped 24,000 railroad ties and 5,000 cedar posts. And by 1876, the little community had the usual amenities and a theater even, and we're thinking about building a library, which is when Feaster and Vogel sold out. Things just went downhill, unfortunately, from there. So the pier here, offshore, again, not in the best of shape. We've got the outer rows of pilings and then just a little bit of the central support piling there. Okay. Going to jump out. We think the mill, again, was located just on the south side of the ravine. The hotel is across the way, the Feaster and Vogel complex to the north. And then the tug of Thomas Spear wreck site is just to the north. So we're going to zoom in on that. You can see it on Google Earth. If you zoom in north of this pier location, it just looks like a kind of an odd shape off. What you're seeing is the side of the vessel. It is turned over during the sinking, and a good portion of it is buried in the sand. So you're just seeing a bit coming out of the water here. This is its namesake and sister ship. So once the Thomas Spear went down, it was a brand new tug, had been in service less than a year. And after it sank, the owners built an exact replica and gave it the exact same name. So this is the Thomas Spears 2. So Thomas Spears 1 would have looked just like this. Okay. And this is what you see on the bottom today. So some of the outer hull planking, the chocks and frames are preserved. Says ceiling planking. This is a nautical term, so if you don't know about shipbuilding, that's not actually the ceiling. This is part of the outer hull, and then part of the mount for the engine. Well, people took 10 years. It took the salvage rights for the ship sold from person to person to person. Everyone was after the engine and the boiler and the machinery for this. In 10 years, someone finally got it out with a very elaborate cofferdam and pulley system was what it took to get the machinery out of this. So it has been salvaged somewhat. The Dean's Pier, I've saved the best for last. This is our largest community, the one we know the best or the most about. So Jim Skibo, who I understand spoke to you all at your last meeting, he's off to the left there, helping set up the transit. Bob Jake, our volunteer, to the right. So just some highlights of Dean's Pier. So founded by Elisha Dean and his cousin John Borland before the Civil War. Pier complex burns to the ground in a wildfire in 1864, so before the Great Peshtigo fire. Borland leaves the firm at that point. J.V. Taylor, a hidden partner, silent partner, purchases his stake. Dean sells then in 67 to his clerk, Edward Bach. In 1869, the Mount Vernon sinks at the pier. That shipwreck is completely buried in the sand. We weren't able to find that. 1875, Bach and another clerk named Keewig. So Fred Bach is Ed's cousin, or sorry, Ed's brother, and Clerk Keewig purchased into the firm, and they began transitioning away from lumber. And we'll get into that a little bit. 1882, they opened a branch store at Norman. 1895, the last cargo was shipped, and the business, once the railroad comes in, moves to Kewanee and Luxembourg. 1903, Bach and Keewig sell the complex, and in 1910, the new owners send it straight into bankruptcy. So this is, again, 1830s aerial photo, and you see that this pier, because it had a far longer lifespan, was in much better condition in the 30s. So the pier road is still bright and shiny here. It's being maintained by a descendant. Most of the buildings, however, are gone. The store should have been over here. The cheese factory should have been over here. Most of the complex should have been up and down this road. And again, completely gone by 38 for the most part. There's a photograph in the 1970s given to us courtesy of the Wolski family who live on the property now. And you see the pier pilings sticking out of the lake in low water conditions, so much more prominently. Onshore, our investigations were able to find the structural depression still with timber involved. This is the remains of the original Dean and Borland mill, preserved at the ravine near what would have been the Mill Pond Dam. Okay, the complex burns in 1864. This is the Civil War. So Borland is actually serving. He's with the Kewanee Guards. He'd been sent down at that point. They were fighting in Arkansas. So he's wounded in the Battle of Jenkins Ferry severely enough that he has to be mustered out and discharged. So he makes his way back. And as he's doing so, that's when the wildfire strikes. So he gets to Dean's Pier to be told that he has lost the equivalent of $1 million. You know, welcome back, glad you served, you're bankrupt pretty much. He moves down to Chicago, goes into lumber shipping there, and eventually earns the money back and dies a millionaire. So he has a fairly happy story at the end. The next set of owners after Dean, Borland, and Taylor are out. So Ed Bach, his brother Frederick Bach, their sister Anna Bach, who marries John Dishmaker Sr., their two sons, John and Fred. then move into the business as well. Fred's wife, Imogene, after he dies, she marries Clerk Wenzel. Clerk Wenzel's daughter marries Alfred Arpin, one of the cheesemakers. At one point, the population of Carlton, which was never big, I've done a little calculating, half of it was their family, these individuals and their children. Unlike the other peers, they owned an extensive farm, not just a farm just to supply their own little needs. Ed Bach in particular was into agriculture. He was the head of the local agricultural society, and he saw the end of the lumber boom coming. So he arranged to get enough land to put in a show farm. They had only the best equipment, only the best seed. He's selling the seed at the company store as well. He's having lectures and readings at the store in the evenings for local farmers to attend, and trying to get everybody to understand that the timber is going to be gone very shortly and they've got to do something else. And he knew exactly what it was going to be. Cheese. He sells the mill, has it disassembled and shipped to Green Bay, put on a railroad and sold into Michigan. Buys a dairy herd and erects a cheese factory instead. This is it in Saturdays after it's been abandoned. One of the first concrete buildings in Kewaunee County. And this business takes off. At one point, it's the second highest ranked cheese factory in Wisconsin, which is saying something. Okay. So going to be down here, south of the ravine and the creek, just opposite the store itself. The mill site is up here on the north side of the ravine. And there's going to be a blacksmith shop a little further north at the intersection. The Mount Vernon goes down just north of the pier. The company for a while owned their own schooners. So partner J.V. Taylor had his own small fleet. The schooner driver is the one that called at the piers the most often during the height of the boom. The steamer Corona is a regular stop on the Goodrich passenger line. The Corona is also taking some wood products south to Chicago, as well as dropping off goods for the store and picking up cheese. Goodrich Propeller de Pere takes over once the lumber boom diminishes and the schooners are going out of service. You see it's a larger ship with better capacity. And we know that they had installed a telegraph line at the store, and Ed and Fred Bach and Keewig made sure that every clerk, all their family members, knew Morse code, so they could listen to telegraph traffic going back and forth and know what people were saying, to the point that election officials would have to block the line there so that they did not hear the results of elections before anyone else did. Okay. Keewig would also listen to the Lake Fleet. When the Goodrich schooners, or sorry, Goodrich propeller ships would stop at Sturgeon Bay, if their cargo holds were almost full, they would sometimes telegraph ahead to Chicago and saying, we don't have enough room for more cargo, we're going to skip Carlton. At which point, Keewig would put his sons in a wagon, rush them up to Kewaunee, send them to the Goodrich ticket office, have them buy tickets back to Carlton, which would force the ships to stop at their pier. And then he could talk the wood or the cheese or whatever goods he had on board at that point. So zooming in, again, this pier is in far better condition. Zooming in again, you've got the terminus, both sides for a good long way, several hundred feet, and a good section of the central support posts. There is at least one post still on the beach for the bridge portion, only exposed during the spring when the creek flushes the sand back off the beach, and then covered again. And the pier itself. So we're going to real quick take a little dive along with our divers so you can see what they saw. And while they're doing this, there was a newspaper correspondent that actually lived adjacent to this farm, which is how we know so much about these people and their lives. And he was a gossip. He could have given Mark Twain a run for his money. So he recorded all kinds of incidents happening at these piers. So I will relate one of them about the schooner Illinois that came to load very, very late in the season. It's November. That's going to be the last run they make because the lake's not going to allow any more traffic. As they're maneuvering on the pier, something goes wrong with the shipping or with the steering, and it drifts straight onto the beach and grounds. At this point, that's it. There's not going to be enough time to get everything reset, get the ship repaired. So the captain orders the ship abandoned. They all get off. They head up the pier road into Carlton looking for lodgings. And they're going to use the telegraph line to radio or to telegraph down to Manitowoc for a tug. And in the meantime, they'll find passage back to Chicago. So the ship is sitting abandoned on the beach overnight. The next morning, the captain gets up, he goes to the lake bluffs, he looks over, and the Illinois is gone. Not there. As you can imagine, he's a little surprised at this. He telegraphs down, said, okay, to remind on the tug, I've got to find my ship. He finds passage and he starts working his way down the coast everywhere going, have you seen the Illinois? Have you seen my schooner? Anybody? As he's doing this, 20 miles off of Milwaukee, this is from Kewaunee County to Milwaukee, 20 miles off Milwaukee, a lake captain notices there's a schooner acting a little strangely in the distance, so he orders them to go investigate. There's the Illinois. Her spars are broken, sails are tattered, she's got a hole in her side, some of her rails are missing, but she is pointed dead straight at Chicago, still going. And the newspaper correspondents just had a field day with that. They said, self-navigating schooners. This is gonna just revolutionize the shipping and lumbering industry. Once this catches on, and everyone howling at how funny this is. So looking down at these pilings, you'll see again, there's some of the structure. You could just make out part of the decking or perhaps one of the buildings that stood on it down at the bottom. We have accounts of people repairing this pier and finding axe heads, dozens of axes that had been dropped over the side by workers and lumbermen. Okay. So what happens to Carlton? Well, most of the rest go out when the lumber boom diminishes. Okay. They just can't compete with the railroads. They don't have anything to ship. They weren't as forward thinking as Carlton was. Okay. They made enough money on the store, this intertwined family, and enough money on the cheese shop again to open a branch store at Norman. That then earns them enough money to make the big jump. And they buy land in Kewaunee itself to the harbor where shipping is still going strong, where the railroad is arriving, and build a 2-story brick department store that employs 8 clerks, has a full basement, the Buck, Kewig, and Poser Company. And if you look in the windows, you just see all kinds of fancy goods, cloth and cookware and iron stoves and lovely things for sale. The store in Carlton, they let their kids run it for a while to get some business experience, and then move them up to Luxembourg and build another branch on the railroad line. At that point, they sell the store out of family hands. And because the family has moved out of Carlton, there's not much left to Carlton anymore. The next family, the owner dies within about 2 years. It's sold to E. Miller, who runs it bankrupt within just a few months. So a full page ad is run. Everyone descends on the store for one last time and empties it out in a grand sale. And this is the story of the piers. Carlton is the only one that succeeded itself to death, but because of Carlton, Kewaunee County changed forever. So the piers eventually decay away into the lakes. Here's the remains of Volk's Pier in Kewaunee itself with some bathing beauties in front of it here. And all of these pier communities seem to have had a similar trajectory. People would land at the mouths of the little creeks and the big rivers, set up a little mill, set up a store, send out a pier, and begin attracting lake traffic. Settlers are incoming, they're moving into the interior, they're beginning to clear, they're shipping their lumber in, lumber camps are being set up seasonally and shipping their lumber to both piers. But because the large river ports have the river, they're attracting that public funding, which means they can improve their harbors and build bigger and better piers, which means they're attracting more lake traffic, which brings in more investment, and this runaway feedback effect starts. So now the little piers are also having to compete with the big piers on top of everything else. As the settlers cut the forest back, the length of road they have to haul timber on increases until the point where it becomes unsustainable. Carlton saw it coming. Ed Bach saw it coming. He opens the cheese factory. So we've got our little cow down there. This means that there's now a market for milk and cream. Farmers begin transitioning their herds to dairy cattle, which causes more people to think, well, I could open a cheese factory, which leads to more dairy. So another feedback effect begins. And eventually, as the forest is cut away completely, the landscape transitions to a dairy economy. The railroad comes in, the piers definitely can't compete with that because railroads don't care if the lake ice is over in the winter. They can run year round, they're cheaper, and the port communities eventually fade out completely. So before I wrap up real quick, I just want to say thank you to Wisconsin's Coastal Management Program for the grant, our volunteers, Bob Jake, Bob LaViolet, Russell Leeds, and others, members of the Ronk family, the fellow Ronk descendants, and now the Wolski family as well. Thanks to Dan Joyce and Crossman Consulting, who provided some sonar and ground penetrating radar for us. Kind landowners, and finally Tamara Thompson, James Skibo, and Caitlin Zamp, my co-workers on this project. And May is Wisconsin Archaeology Month. So next 2 weeks, 2 months from now, we're going to be going up to Door County to continue this study. And by chance, our image this year is the Tops Point Lime Kiln, which is another one of these lost pier communities up at the northern part of Door County. So with that, thank you. And I will stop sharing screen.
That was
Okay.
really nice, fascinating
Okay.
talk.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting. I always say one of my benefits of being the moderator of the program, I get to start with my question. So do you know where the Ronks Luxembourgers?
Yes, yes, they were.
Yeah, and my family came from Luxembourg also. I was
All
just
right,
curious.
connections.
Yeah,
Look for some Ronk in your heritage.
yeah. So let's see what we have here. Some nice comments about the information. And Mary Dragatis, I'm going to turn on your microphone because I'm not sure, you had a comment about your Dutch heritage, and I'm not quite sure what you were getting at, and I have to hold it.
Yep.
I'll get to it here, unless you understand what she's saying.
I understand what she's saying. Yeah, so she is, so this is a pattern that's showing up over and over and over again with the immigrants to the Lake counties, is they will arrive at the main port city, mostly Milwaukee, and then they stay there for a year or two. Is they're acclimatizing to Wisconsin and the culture. And then after they've kind of catch their breath and they've recouped some of their finances from the voyage over, they've accumulated, for example, they're going to need a wagon, they're going to need oxen, then they move into the interior that way. And every single one of these immigrants accounts that I can find for these pier communities, they're doing the exact same thing. So the dish makers, they're staying in Milwaukee. The boxers staying in Milwaukee. Everyone pauses there for a little bit and they head north. So sometimes they're going straight inland on the early roads in the Native American trail system. Sometimes they're booking passage on these lumber schooners. So they would pay to basically become cargo on the trip north. And then they'd be dropped off, either lighted off onto the beach in the ship's boat or dropped off directly onto the piers. So that's probably what's happening there.
So back to another one of my questions.
Okay.
That's empty right now, so I can ask another one. So my ancestors ran a mill at Little Harbor, Michigan, which was in Badenoch, and they had this similar bluff, and I always wondered how they got the wood products down off the bluff to the lake level. Very,
very carefully in most instances. So there is one of the southernmost ones in Ozaukee County, Port Ulau, one of the cordwood sort of gas station type pier communities. They actually built a flume. So you could push the cordwood right and it would slide right down the bluffs. They have very steep bluffs there, right, and then right out onto the pier. You see for Ronks, they've got a little tram system going. The bluffs are not high there, however. Once you get up in Kewaunee County, they're pretty high. We have several accounts of incidents coming down the bluffs. So I mentioned, for example, a horse and wagon kind of Thelma and Louising into the lake. This isn't one of those incidents. So the wagon driver gets off at the top of the bluff. You can imagine. He's got a grade about like this. He's got to get this wagon and a load like that. You can imagine he was carrying tan bark. And so he gets out to chain the back wheel of the wagon so that it can't roll. And so this is allowing the wagon to more slide than it is roll. So it's slowing it down. He got to the bottom, gets back out, unchains the wheel. And as he's doing that, some of that bark piled on the wagon fell off and landed on one of the horses, which spooked it, and out they go. So this account lets us know that they are being exceptionally careful. And they're having to stop at these places and chain up and then very, very, very slowly and carefully pick their way down. We know at Carlton, based on where the pier piling is on the beach, they weren't bringing that pier road all the way down. They were building the bridge portion up, so it was catching the bluff part of the way up the bluff. at least a little to try and reduce the amount of grade they had to come down for that. I still can't imagine bringing loads like that, tons of wood at a time down on those wagons. And we know that the piers and haulers are not being paid very much. I did a few calculations. It's about $750 to $950 an hour. So barely minimum wage, really.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn on another microphone. John Mirborn has a question, I think. He raised his hand at least, so I hope he's willing to talk.
Sure.
Go ahead, John.
Still muted, John. Okay.
All right, I'll see if there's another chat here.
Okay.
So Mary again is asking whether you've heard of Melinda Roberts.
Melinda Roberts. No, this is not a name that's come up. Okay. So she with Pier, I hope.
Let's see if I can turn her microphone on
Okay.
to elaborate.
Mhm.
Turning microphones on is sometimes a little difficult.
Okay.
Are you there, Mary?
All right.
Okay. So much for that. Unless
Oh,
you
Oh,
okay.
here she goes. Here she goes.
I got it. I got it.
All right.
Okay. Thanks. Melinda Roberts lived over there towards Lake Michigan, but she was just before she passed away.
Mhm.
She was starting a book about the ghost towns of Wisconsin.
Oh, goodness. I had not heard that. Oh, do you know how far she got?
Probably not very far.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay. Yeah. Well, just as we were starting our project, the WUA, the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association, they were working up the Claybanks area, southern Door County. So I really, in history and archaeology and science, sometimes you'll see these waves where everyone is suddenly working on the same thing at the same time.
Mhm.
So I wonder if it's time for this coastal story to be told now and it's kind of making its way into people's consciousness. So I'm sorry to hear she passed. Would have been nice to compare notes with her.
Yes.
But oh goodness.
She was particularly interested in all of the Wisconsin historical markers, and she knew all of them. Had
Yes.
them on her website.
Yeah, we've got people who can't capture them like Pokemon. You've got to visit them all. So
Yeah. So thank you so much. I mean,
thank you.
that's so interesting. I'm still trying to figure out how my ancestors got to the Milwaukee area. I think that they may have even had their passage paid to get here. And that's because that's what happened with some of the Polish ancestors.
Yes.
There.
Okay.
So you've given me a little bit of a hint, and I'll see what I can come up with. Thank you.
I've done a fair amount of research and looking into the Luxembourg aspect, and there were a lot of people from Luxembourg that migrated to both Wisconsin and Michigan. And there was definitely a culture that remained, and they brought with them. So it was fascinating to understand the stories. That's about it for the chat and Q&A that I can see. Lots of compliments. It was an interesting program.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's amazing to me that all these little towns all developed around these little piers and shipping ports. And so it, like I said, gave me an insight to some of the activities of my Luxembourger ancestors in the sea in Little Harbor, because it would have been almost identical, I think, in terms of the way they operated in the same time frame too. So.
Well, I hope to bring more of this research to you. Again, we'll be up at Door County shortly, and the end goal on all this is to write a book. So we do want to get these stories told somehow.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Don, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Amy. I thought
about next month's program.
We're working on next month's program. We have a speaker lined up, but we haven't got everything finalized yet. We will be talking to her this week. And if it comes to fruition, we will send out information to everybody at the very beginning of the month.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Good night.